My earliest memories are steeped in darkness and uneasy whispers. It all began on a chilly autumn evening in London, a city whose foggy streets and hidden alleys were the perfect backdrop for secrets and forbidden encounters. I remember the overwhelming scent of damp stone and rain-soaked pavement as I hurried along narrow lanes behind my home, my heart pounding in sync with the distant toll of Big Ben. In that oppressive gloom, the boundaries between right and wrong, safe and dangerous, blurred into a haze of pain and mystery. It was on such an evening that my stepfather, Alexander, made his presence brutally known. I was barely a teenager when he cornered me in a deserted corridor of our sprawling old townhouse. The corridor, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, transformed into a stage for his menace. With no one around to hear my stifled cries, he pushed me against the cold, unforgiving wall. I could feel his heavy breath and the dangerous heat of his intentions as his fingers slowly wrapped around my wrist. I remember my body tensing up, caught between the instinct to flee and the paralysis of fear. In that moment, every heartbeat was a silent scream, a desperate plea for escape. Later, as the rain began to fall in a relentless drizzle outside, I would lie awake in my small, dimly lit room, haunted by the memory of that night. The image of Alexander's dark eyes, glinting with predatory satisfaction, was seared into my mind. I tried to convince myself that the world was not as sinister as it seemed, that the horrors of that night were an aberration. But deep down, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Despite the terror of those early encounters, the passage of time brought with it a peculiar kind of resignation. I grew up with the constant awareness of his presence, a shadow looming over every corner of our home. Alexander, now 60 years old, carried himself with an air of cold confidence. He was impeccably dressed in tailored suits and expensive accessories, exuding a dangerous charm that unsettled everyone who crossed his path. Every time he entered a room, a hush would fall over the space, as if the very atmosphere was compelled to pay homage to his dominating presence. My mother, ever the enigma, chose to ignore the whispers and hidden glances that spoke of our family's troubled dynamics. She defended Alexander with an almost mechanical fervor, insisting that he was a good man despite the shadows that clung to him. "Sophia, be polite," she would say, as if rehearsing lines from a script that had long lost its meaning. I couldn't understand how she could be so blinded by his charm when I saw the darker side of his calculated intent every single day. In the years that followed, I began to observe Alexander's every move with a growing sense of wariness. His interactions with other family members and guests were always laced with a tension that I could neither explain nor ignore. At family gatherings in our ancient London townhouse, I would watch as every conversation, every passing glance, seemed to hide layers of unspoken threats and forbidden desires. The man who was meant to be a pillar of our household was, in truth, a master of manipulation, a puppeteer whose silent cues and subtle provocations left a trail of unease in his wake. One particular evening remains etched in my memory as a turning point, a moment when I first began to understand that the game he was playing was far more complex than I had ever imagined. It was a cold, blustery night, and I had slipped away from the crowded living room during a family dinner. The clatter of cutlery and half-hearted laughter provided a backdrop to my inner turmoil. Seeking solace, I wandered into the narrow, winding corridors of our home, where the only light came from the occasional street lamp seeping through heavy curtains. In a quiet corner, I caught sight of Alexander. He stood there, leaning casually against the wall, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his eyes scanning the dim room with a look that was both predatory and disarmingly calm. "Are you tired already?" he asked, his voice low and deliberately provocative, as if he intended to stir something deep within me. His question wasn't one of casual conversation, it was a challenge. I could feel my pulse quicken in response, my body betraying the cold detachment I tried so desperately to maintain. "I just don't like big parties," I muttered, more to myself than to him, my words barely audible in the silence that followed. In that brief exchange, I sensed that Alexander's interest in me was more than mere curiosity. It was a calculated intrusion into the fragile boundaries of my inner world. The city of London, with all its historical grandeur and modern dynamism, became the silent witness to our tumultuous relationship. Its rain-slicked cobblestone streets and foggy alleys mirrored the labyrinth of emotions that I struggled to navigate. Every day, as I made my way through the bustling markets of Camden or the quiet parks of Kensington, the memory of that first, horrifying encounter lingered. London was both a refuge and a prison, a place where the past and the present coexisted in a delicate balance of beauty and decay. In the solitude of my room, I would pore over my thoughts, trying to make sense of a life that had been irrevocably altered by one man's presence. I began to document my feelings, scribbling down fragments of memories and half-formed questions in a worn notebook. Was I merely a victim of circumstance? Or was there a hidden strength within me waiting to be unleashed? The more I reflected on Alexander's calculated actions, the more I realized that his influence extended far beyond the physical boundaries of our home. He was a constant reminder that beneath the veneer of civility, even the most genteel lives could harbor secrets and unspoken pain. The early days in London were marked by a series of small, almost imperceptible moments, a lingering touch here, a furtive glance there, that slowly chipped away at the fragile barriers I had built around myself. It was as if Alexander was testing my limits, probing for vulnerabilities I wasn't even aware I possessed. In those moments of forced introspection, I began to see the world with a new clarity. The familiar streets of London, once bathed in the warm glow of childhood memories, now took on an edge of stark realism. Every shadow, every quiet corner, seemed to whisper of dangers lurking just beyond the reach of ordinary sight. I realized then that the true battle was not merely against an external oppressor, but against the creeping doubts and fears that had taken root within me. Alexander's presence had ignited a silent revolution, a determination to reclaim my sense of self and to confront the painful truths that had long been buried beneath layers of deception. As I stood at the window of my room, watching the rain patter against the glass, I knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. Yet, amidst the uncertainty and lingering terror, there was a spark of defiance, a promise to break free from the suffocating grip of a past that had no right to define my future. This is where my story truly begins, on the foggy streets of London, in the quiet moments of introspection that follow the darkest of nights. With each passing day, I vowed to understand the intricate web of manipulation that Alexander had woven around our lives. I would observe, analyze, and most importantly, learn to see through the carefully constructed facade of charm and control. For the first time, I was determined to transform my fear into a weapon, a means of exposing the secrets that lay hidden in the heart of our troubled existence. As the city of London continued to pulse with its own relentless energy, I set forth on a journey of self-discovery. I knew that the road ahead would not be easy, and that the legacy of that fateful night would haunt me for years to come. Yet, in the midst of the shadows and the lingering echoes of betrayal, a new chapter was beginning, one where I would take control of my own destiny. And so, beneath the watchful gaze of London's ancient clock towers and amidst the ceaseless rhythm of rain and pavement, I prepared myself to face the truth about Alexander, about my own hidden strength, and about the complex, painful tapestry that was my life. In the weeks that followed that fateful night, the oppressive atmosphere of our London home grew even more unbearable. Every day blurred into the next, a relentless cycle of silent glances and half-spoken words, as if the house itself were conspiring to keep its secrets hidden. I found myself walking the narrow streets of Camden and Kensington with a heavy heart, trying to escape the suffocating tension that clung to every corner of my life. Yet, no matter how far I roamed, Alexander's presence, his calculated, ever-watchful gaze, seemed to follow me, a constant reminder of a past I could neither erase nor ignore. The transformation in Alexander was subtle yet unmistakable. His refined exterior remained impeccable, his tailored suits and silver cufflinks as polished as ever, but there was an edge to his smile, a glint of satisfaction that hinted at a hidden agenda. Each morning, as I reluctantly emerged from the shadows of my bedroom, I felt the weight of his influence, as though his very existence had rewritten the rules of our household. My mother's once comforting reassurances had become brittle echoes in a space overrun by secrets and quiet confrontations. One dreary afternoon, while the relentless drizzle blurred the view of the Thames, I found myself alone in the study, a room heavy with the scent of old books and regret. The silence was suddenly shattered by the creak of the door, and there he stood, Alexander, leaning against the frame with an air of nonchalance that belied the turmoil beneath. His eyes, dark and inscrutable, met mine without a hint of remorse or apology. "Sophia," he said, his tone cool and measured, "we need to discuss the events of last night." His voice, smooth as ever, carried a subtle challenge that made my pulse race. I swallowed hard, steeling myself for a conversation that I both dreaded and craved. "I don't know what you mean," I replied, my voice wavering just enough to betray my inner conflict. A slow, almost imperceptible smile curved his lips. "You can't pretend, can you? Every glance you cast, every word you withhold, it speaks volumes." The quiet accusation in his voice resonated deep within me, stirring a mixture of anger and reluctant curiosity. I recalled the way he had watched me in the dim light of the corridor, the intensity in his eyes, as if he were reading my very thoughts. Was he merely a predator, or was there something more, a desire to unveil a truth hidden behind layers of manipulation? For days after that encounter, the air between us throbbed with an unspoken contest, a silent duel of wills where every conversation, every carefully measured pause, carried the weight of unsaid truths. I began to scrutinize his behavior, noting the slight shift in his posture when he thought I wasn't watching, the way his gaze would linger just a moment too long. In return, I became more guarded, my smiles tight and my responses clipped. Yet, beneath that veneer of defiance, a part of me yearned to break free from the shackles of this dangerous game. The turning point came on a cold evening as we shared a quiet dinner in our dimly lit dining room. The clatter of cutlery and soft murmur of conversation around us contrasted sharply with the charged silence that existed between Alexander and me. As I reached for a sip of water, I felt his eyes on me, intense, probing, and undeniably challenging. Unable to bear the weight of his silent scrutiny any longer, I ventured a question that had been burning in my mind. "What do you really want from me?" My voice, though soft, cut through the ambient noise like a razor's edge. For a moment, time seemed to pause. Alexander's fork hovered mid-air, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Then, in a tone that was both unsettling and sincere, he answered, "I want you to understand that nothing is ever as it appears. We are both playing roles, trapped in a dance of deception. And sometimes, the only way to survive is to learn the steps." His words, though cryptic, resonated with a truth that was impossible to ignore. That night, as the city's lights flickered through the rain-streaked window, I lay awake wrestling with his confession. The boundaries between victim and accomplice, predator and pawn, had blurred into a labyrinth of conflicting emotions. I realized that every moment with him was a calculated move, each smile, each subtle touch, laden with hidden meaning. It was a dangerous game, one that promised both ruin and revelation. And as the shadows of our past stretched long into the night, I knew that the dance of deception was far from over. The tension in our home had escalated into a near-constant state of unease. In the weeks following our charged dinner, every interaction with Alexander felt like a deliberate test, a challenge to my will and a mirror reflecting my hidden fears. I found myself trapped between defiance and reluctant understanding, questioning if his cryptic words were a threat, a confession, or something else entirely. That evening, as the storm raged outside, I sat in the study with the only light coming from a single desk lamp. Rain battered the window, its steady rhythm echoing the turmoil in my mind. The flickering light cast jagged shadows on the walls, as if the very darkness itself was trying to speak. I recalled Alexander's earlier admission about our roles in this dangerous dance of deception. Was I truly a pawn in his calculated game, or was there more to the connection that tethered us together? The answer began to unfold when I discovered a small notebook tucked away on a shelf. A notebook filled with Alexander's meticulous scribbles and cryptic observations. His handwriting was neat yet forceful, each line revealing fragments of his thoughts on power, control, and the delicate interplay between desire and fear. As I read his words, a chill ran down my spine. They spoke of a life spent manipulating outcomes, of a carefully constructed facade that crumbled only in the rarest of moments. In those passages, I sensed not only the cold ambition of a man who had mastered the art of survival, but also a deep-seated vulnerability he fought to hide. Later that night, unable to sleep, I wandered into the dimly lit hallway. The old portraits of long-departed ancestors seemed to watch my every step, their eyes heavy with secrets. It was then that I caught a glimpse of Alexander in the mirror, a fleeting image that made my heart race. His reflection was as composed as ever, but for a moment, I saw something unguarded in his eyes, a flash of regret, perhaps, or an admission of pain too profound to voice. This brief encounter shattered the illusion of his unyielding control. I wondered if the man behind the meticulously crafted mask was tormented by the same ghosts that haunted me. In the following days, the air between us grew even more charged. Our conversations, sparse and laced with tension, became a battleground where every word carried weight. During one such exchange, while I was alone in the kitchen preparing a cup of tea, Alexander approached silently. His presence was overwhelming, yet his tone was softer than usual. "Sophia," he began, his voice low and measured, "there is a part of me that is tired of this endless masquerade. I want you to see me, not just the role I play." His words, though hesitant, resonated deeply within me, stirring a mixture of empathy and suspicion. Was this an attempt at genuine connection? Or merely another layer of manipulation designed to keep me off balance? I responded with guarded curiosity. "And what is it that you truly want, Alexander?" My voice trembled slightly, betraying the inner conflict I struggled to conceal. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence between us was as potent as any declaration. Finally, he admitted, "I want redemption, or perhaps understanding. I want to be seen for who I am beneath all this artifice." His confession, raw and unpolished, opened a fissure in the wall of our mutual hostility. In that brief moment, I glimpsed the man behind the calculated charm, the man who bore scars of choices made in shadows. Yet, even as this fragile bridge of understanding began to form, the chaos outside our private moments threatened to shatter it. My mother's distant demeanor grew ever more pronounced, and whispers of her own secret struggles permeated the house. The family unit, once held together by unspoken bonds, now teetered on the brink of disintegration. Each of us, in our own way, wrestled with the consequences of Alexander's influence and the pervasive atmosphere of betrayal. As days turned into nights, the storm inside me raged on, echoing the tempest outside. I resolved to confront my own demons, to disentangle my identity from the twisted web of manipulation that had been spun around me. In quiet moments of reflection, while staring out at rain-drenched London streets, I began to write down my thoughts, hoping that in the act of recording my truth, I might reclaim some measure of control. The dance of deception that had defined my existence was slowly transforming into a fragile ballet of honesty and pain. I knew that the path ahead would be fraught with peril, and that every revelation would come at a steep price. But for the first time, I felt a stirring of hope, a belief that even in the midst of darkness, there might be a way to break free. And as I stared into the mirror that night, I saw not just the reflection of a victim, but the emerging image of someone ready to challenge the forces that sought to define her. In the shattered light of that stormy night, amidst the echoes of our shared secrets, I silently vowed to uncover the truth about Alexander and, in the process, to find the strength to forge my own destiny. In the wake of shattered illusions and long-held deceptions, London's grey skies seemed to mirror the state of my soul. The once unyielding tension that had defined our existence was now giving way to an uneasy calm, a silence heavy with the burden of truth and the promise of new beginnings. It all came to a head one rainy evening. The steady patter of raindrops against the window offered a hypnotic cadence to the unfolding reckoning. My mother, whose distant demeanor had grown into a chasm of unspoken grief, sat alone in the parlor. Her eyes, once filled with an elusive hope, now betrayed a quiet resignation. It was in that somber moment that she finally spoke of the secrets that had fractured our family. With a tremor in her voice, she confessed that her heart had long been divided, torn between loyalty to a man whose charm had once beguiled her and the crushing reality of his betrayal. Alexander, the man who had woven his silent provocations into every corner of our lives, was nowhere to be seen. His departure had been as sudden as it was inexplicable, leaving behind a void that was both painful and liberating. In his absence, I found myself facing the harsh reality of our fractured family, and for the first time, the intricate web of manipulation began to unravel. The betrayal that had once defined every interaction was now a catalyst for change, a bitter yet necessary confrontation with our own vulnerabilities. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in our home shifted. Conversations, once hushed and laced with uncertainty, turned towards tentative honesty. I began to reconcile the conflicting images of myself, the victim of a dark past and the emerging woman determined to reclaim her future. I took long walks through the rain-washed streets of London, letting the cool drizzle cleanse the remnants of fear and sorrow. The city, with its ancient stone and resilient spirit, became a silent mentor, urging me to find strength in vulnerability. One afternoon, while wandering along the banks of the Thames, I encountered an old friend who had always sensed there was more to my story than I had dared reveal. In his empathetic gaze, I found a mirror reflecting not only the pain of the past, but also the promise of redemption. Our conversation was unburdened by the weight of judgment. Instead, it was a gentle affirmation that even in the darkest of times, there could be a light, a way to rebuild. That encounter ignited a determination within me to seek out the truths I had long avoided. I pored over faded photographs, revisited neglected memories, and finally began to write down the story of my life, each word a step towards reclaiming the narrative that had been stolen from me. In the act of writing, I found solace and a measure of control over the chaos that had once seemed insurmountable. As the months passed, the raw wounds of betrayal slowly began to heal, replaced by a cautious optimism. The game of deception that Alexander had once orchestrated was over, leaving in its wake a profound lesson. that strength could be found in confronting one's own fragility. My mother, too, embarked on her own journey of introspection, reaching out to mend the bonds that had frayed under the weight of secrets and lies. Now, standing at the precipice of a future once shrouded in despair, I felt an unfamiliar sense of empowerment. The storm that had raged inside me was subsiding, replaced by the gentle, persistent pulse of renewal. In that quiet strength, I finally understood that every painful encounter had been a stepping stone, a necessary part of a long, arduous path toward self-discovery and freedom. The final chapter of this tumultuous saga was not a neat conclusion, but rather the beginning of a new story. A story in which I reclaimed the right to define who I was, unburdened by the ghosts of manipulation and betrayal. As I looked out over London's misty skyline, I vowed to embrace the future with open arms, ready to transform every shadow of the past into a beacon of hope for tomorrow.